The evening light faded across the narrow English terrace as Harold Bennett, 70 years old and trembling from exhaustion, stood in the doorway of the house he had once filled with laughter, birthdays, and memories that stretched across a lifetime. His suitcase, small, worn, far too light for all he had lived, rested beside him on the step as his last remaining relative closed the door without so much as a backward glance. The lock clicked with a sharp finality, sealing him out of a life he had spent decades holding together. Harold didn't speak, didn't knock. He simply steadied himself against the railing, while the cold crept into his bones. Across the street, Margaret, a retired librarian with a soft cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, paused mid-step as she watched him. Something in his posture, defeated yet still quietly dignified, made her stop breathing for a moment.
If you saw a 70-year-old man forced out of the home he built from nothing, would you walk past or stop to ask what happened? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your view matters more than you think. What follows next is a story of loss, resilience, and the unexpected kindness that changes everything. Harold remained on the doorstep for several seconds after the lock snapped shut, his hand still hovering near the handle, as though the door might open again if he simply waited long enough. The fading sunlight stretched across the pavement in long, tired lines, mirroring the heaviness settling across his shoulders. He lowered his hands slowly, the truth washing through him with a quiet, cutting clarity he hadn't prepared for. He bent down to lift his suitcase, the fabric worn thin from years of travel and use. It felt heavier than it should have, though he knew the weight came from something far deeper than the items inside. Inside were only a few shirts, an old photograph frame, and the journal he had kept faithfully for most of his life. Everything else, every memory, every gesture of care, every echo of the past, remained behind the closed door he could no longer claim. The street was unusually quiet for early evening. A soft wind rustled through the hedges, stirring the scent of damp earth rising from a recently watered garden nearby. Harold stepped down carefully, his joints stiff, his knees resisting the new demand he placed on them. The world felt somehow unfamiliar, as though the simple act of being pushed from his home had altered the shape of the street he had walked along for decades. Across the road, Margaret paused mid-stride, her shopping bag gripped tightly in both hands. She had seen Harold many times, sweeping his steps in the early morning, tending to the rose bush that climbed halfway up his brick wall, carrying groceries home with a quiet determination that never seemed to falter. But she had never seen him like this, shoulders caved slightly inward, eyes distant, breathing shallow, as though each moment took more effort than the last. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Harold," she called gently, her voice soft but steady. He turned his head, surprised, as though he had forgotten the world still turned around him. "Oh, Margaret," he murmured, attempting a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sorry, didn't see you there." Margaret stepped closer, concern etched clearly across her face. "Are you all right? You look pale. Do you need help?" Harold opened his mouth, then paused, unsure how to explain something so large with words that felt too small. I'm just sorting myself out," he said finally, his voice steady but thin. "It seems I won't be staying here anymore." Margaret blinked slowly, absorbing his words. "You mean you've been asked to leave?" Harold nodded, lowering his gaze. "Let's call it what it is. I've been told my presence is an inconvenience, and so here I am." Margaret felt something tighten inside her chest. She glanced at the closed door, then at Harold's trembling hands gripping the suitcase handle.
She had known loneliness in her own life. Widowhood had reshaped her years in ways she never expected. But the sight of Harold, standing outside his own home, struck a deeper chord. "Come with me," she said quietly, but firmly. "At least for a walk. Standing here in the cold won't do you any good." Harold hesitated, resistance flickering across his features. He was not a man who leaned easily on others, not even in moments like this. Yet the earnestness in Margaret's voice softened something in him. "All right," he said finally. "A short walk." They began walking down the pavement, Harold leaning slightly on his cane, Margaret matching her pace to his. The quiet between them wasn't tense or awkward. It simply lived in the space where words were too fragile to hold the truth. As they moved away from the house that had once meant everything to him, Harold let out a slow, unsteady breath. The door behind him remained shut, and for the first time in years, he felt the unfamiliar ache of having nowhere to return to.
Margaret kept her steps slow as they walked along the narrow curve of Willowbank Road, the evening breeze tugging lightly at their coats. The sky above them shifted into muted shades of lavender and steel gray, the kind of sky that promised a quiet night but offered little warmth. Harold leaned heavier on his cane than usual, though he tried to mask the strain with a steady expression. They passed by the small bakery where Harold once bought fresh rolls every Sunday morning. The familiar chiming of the doorbell brought a flicker of memory to his eyes, but instead of entering, he paused only long enough to steady his breath. Margaret noticed and gently touched his arm. "We can stop if you need to," she offered. "No," he replied softly. "If I stop, I may not start again." Margaret nodded, sensing the truth buried beneath his words. It wasn't exhaustion he feared. It was the weight of standing still with nowhere to go. They continued down the lane until they reached the old stone bridge that crossed over the shallow stream. The water beneath flowed softly, catching the glow of a nearby street lamp in broken reflections. Harold rested against the railing, gripping it with both hands as the cool metal pressed into his palms. Margaret set her shopping bag down beside her and leaned close enough to offer presence without pressure. A few moments passed before Harold finally spoke. "I lived in that house for 40 years, he said quietly. "Through arguments, celebrations, losses, everything. And now suddenly I'm not needed there." Margaret lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry, truly." "It's strange," Harold continued, eyes fixed on the glowing reflections dancing below. "You spend your whole life believing family is a constant. Then one day you become too slow, too forgetful, too inconvenient. And it turns out love was tied to what you could do, not who you were." His voice faltered, and Margaret felt her heart strain. She knew the weight of that truth herself. After her husband passed, there were days she sensed the world shifting her gently aside, as though grief made her a step out of rhythm with everyone else. "Harold," she said softly, "you deserve better than that. Everyone does." He offered a faint, sad smile. "I suppose so, but deserving and receiving don't always match." A pair of teenagers cycled past them, laughter echoing briefly across the bridge before fading into the distance. The world carried on, unaware of the quiet collapse unfolding beside the railing. Harold closed his eyes briefly, the cold air brushing against his lined cheeks. Margaret picked up her bag and straightened her shoulders. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's walk a bit further. Sitting alone with thoughts like these doesn't help." Harold nodded, and together they made their way toward the small green at the end of the road. The grass was damp from the earlier rain, glistening under the dim glow of the street lamps. A wooden bench, slightly weathered, slightly crooked, waited under the old oak tree. They sat, the quiet of the green settling around them like a soft blanket. Harold placed his suitcase at his feet and let his shoulders relax slightly. Margaret watched him closely, sensing the delicate balance between strength and fragility within him. "You know," she said softly, "people talk about old age like it's a burden, but it's a lifetime of stories, a library of everything you've endured." Harold exhaled slowly. "Sometimes I think my stories have worn out their welcome. Not with me. Not with me." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted behind his tired eyes. A flicker of warmth, a faint hint of belonging, the kind that takes root slowly, without noise, but steadies a person when the world feels unkind. As night settled deeper over the green, Harold realized this walk wasn't about leaving something behind. It was the beginning of being seen again.
The bench beneath the old oak tree creaked lightly as Harold shifted, drawing a slow breath while the cool air carried the faint scent of wet grass. Margaret sat beside him, careful not to press him with questions, yet her steady presence made the silence between them feel less like heaviness and more like permission. After a long pause, Harold's fingers tapped lightly against his cane, a small, restless motion that signaled something deeper, stirring. "I wasn't always alone," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the dim path ahead. "There was a time when life felt full, noisy, messy, crowded, but full." His voice softened, tinged with both fondness and mourning. "My wife, Evelyn, was the sort of woman who filled a room just by being in it. She had this way of making everyone feel welcome, even when we had nothing to spare." Margaret listened, hands folded gently in her lap, letting his memories unfold at their own pace. "We married young," Harold continued, "back when the world felt simpler. We built that house together, brick by brick. Not literally, mind you, neither of us could lay a straight brick if our lives depended on it, but everything inside it was ours. Our traditions, our arguments, our dreams, even our silly routines." He smiled briefly. "She used to burn toast every Sunday, without fail. The smoke alarm became part of the ritual." Margaret chuckled softly, the sound encouraging him. "It was all fine until she fell ill. Slow at first, then all at once." He lowered his gaze. "Watching someone you've loved your whole life forget your name is a kind of pain no one prepares you for." Margaret's eyes softened. "I'm so sorry, Harold. She passed nearly 10 years ago, and the house never felt quite the same. I tried to keep it going, tried to fill the silence with hobbies, routines, anything, really. But losing her left a hollow in the walls that nothing could fill." A light breeze brushed the branches above them, scattering a few old leaves onto the path. "My family visited for a while. Out of respect, I suppose," Harold said with a faint shrug. "But slowly the visits changed. Less time talking, more time checking their watches. Less interest in me, more concern about what would happen when I couldn't manage things myself." Margaret frowned gently, recognizing the familiar shape of that shift, affection turned obligation. "I think they wanted to help," Harold added, "but help has a way of becoming control when you're no longer young. Decisions were made around me, sometimes for me, and I told myself they meant well." His fingers tightened on his cane. "But affection was replaced with impatience, then impatience with frustration, and finally frustration with distance." He exhaled slowly, a deep, aching breath. "This morning," Harold said, voice barely above a whisper, "I was told I held the house back.
that my slowness was becoming a problem, that they were tired of rearranging their lives around me. He paused, as if I hadn't once rearranged everything for them. Margaret reached over, resting her hand lightly on his. "You didn't deserve that," she said softly. "Love isn't something earned through convenience." Harold nodded, though the pain still lingered in his expression. "I suppose I kept hoping things would return to how they were. But I should have known that memories and promises don't hold everyone the same way they hold me." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "Some of us still keep them close." Harold looked at her, the grief in his eyes shifting into something quieter, an acknowledgement that he had been heard, understood, held with compassion rather than pity. And for the first time in years, speaking his story didn't feel like opening a wound. It felt like letting something finally breathe.
By the time Harold and Margaret stood from the bench, the sky had slipped fully into evening, its muted blues deepening into a quiet dusk. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting long shadows across the green as the air grew colder. Harold steadied himself on his cane, but Margaret noticed the subtle tremor in his hands and the slight heaviness in his steps. "Let's head toward the main road," she suggested, sensing his fatigue. "It's better lit there." Harold nodded, though his breath came a little shorter than before. They walked slowly along the footpath, passing shuttered shops and quiet houses. The wind picked up, nudging fallen leaves around their ankles and settling a chill deep into Harold's bones. Margaret kept close, subtly adjusting her pace to match his faltering rhythm. Halfway down Brookside Lane, Harold's steps wavered. He paused by a stone wall, bracing himself with both hands as a wave of dizziness washed over him. Margaret immediately stepped in front of him, her voice firm but gentle. "Harold, are you all right?" He blinked, disoriented. Just a moment, I lost my footing." But Margaret saw the truth in his pale complexion and the way he leaned too heavily on the wall. She placed a supportive hand on his arm. "Sit," she insisted softly. "Don't push yourself." He nodded faintly, allowing her to guide him toward the low wall. He sat with visible relief, his breaths uneven and cold air clinging to every exhale. Margaret crouched beside him, concern sharpening her features. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," she said quietly. "Your body's been through too much today." Harold attempted a small smile. "I didn't expect the world to feel so wide once I had no door to walk through." Margaret felt a sting behind her eyes. He wasn't just tired, he was displaced in the truest sense, caught between the home he'd lost and the uncertainty he hadn't learned to navigate. She glanced around the dim street, the lamplight stretching thinly across the pavement, and made a decision without hesitation. "Come on," she said gently. "You're coming home with me. Just for tonight." Harold stiffened. "Margaret, I couldn't possibly impose like that." "You're not imposing," she replied firmly. "You're exhausted, you're cold, and you need warmth, not pride, keeping you out here." He hesitated, the battle between independence and necessity flickering across his expression. Finally, he nodded, a quiet surrender born from fatigue rather than weakness. "All right," he whispered, "if you're sure." Margaret helped him to his feet, looping her arm through his to steady him. The two of them made their way up the lane, Harold leaning a little heavier with each step. The night had grown colder and the wind sharper, but Margaret's presence created a small pocket of steadiness beside him. By the time they reached her cottage, Harold's limbs felt leaden. Margaret fumbled briefly with the key before ushering him inside, where warm lamplight spilled across the hallway. The familiar smell of books, lavender polish, and old carpet enveloped Harold instantly. It felt like stepping into a memory, soft, comforting, deeply human. Margaret guided him to the armchair near the fireplace, fetching a blanket and warming it quickly near the heater,
before wrapping it around his shoulders. "Rest," she murmured. "I'll get the kettle on." Harold leaned back, eyes closing as warmth seeped slowly into the places where cold had hollowed him out. He hadn't expected to find shelter tonight, not in a physical sense, nor in the quiet kindness that had carried him from the pavement to this room. As Margaret moved about the kitchen, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in months begin to settle in his chest. Safety. And safety felt dangerously close to hope.
Margaret moved quietly around her cottage, the warm kitchen light spilling into the sitting room, where Harold rested in the armchair. The blanket wrapped around his shoulders carried the gentle scent of lavender detergent, and the soft crackle from the heater played like a reassuring rhythm in the background. Harold watched her move, gratitude building inside him with a weight he struggled to hold. "Tea will be ready in a moment," Margaret said, glancing over her shoulder. "And I've some broth left from yesterday. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm." Harold shook his head softly. "You didn't have to do all this." Margaret poured water into 2 mugs. "Maybe not, but someone should have." She brought the tray into the sitting room, setting it carefully on the table. Harold reached for the tea with hands that still trembled, though the warmth of the cottage had begun to loosen the stiffness in his fingers. He sipped slowly, closing his eyes as the heat spread through him like a soft wave. "This is the first time I've felt warm all day," he admitted quietly. Margaret settled into the chair opposite him. "You've carried too much for one person, Harold. You need a place to rest, not just somewhere to sleep, but somewhere to breathe." He swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "I didn't expect to find kindness today, not after everything that happened." "That's how kindness works," Margaret replied gently. "It finds us on the edges." They sat in silence for a few moments, the cottage holding them in a comfortable stillness. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the windows, but in here, the air remained warm and steady. Harold let his gaze wander across the bookshelves lining the walls. Rows of old paperbacks, photo frames, and small ornaments that reflected a life lived quietly but fully. Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "You look tired," she said softly. "Not in the way sleep fixes, in the way carrying grief does." Harold lowered his gaze. "I've felt hollow for years. Losing Evelyn, then losing the house to indifference. It wears you down." Margaret nodded with a softness that came from experience. "Grief reshapes us. It doesn't disappear, but it doesn't have to crush us either." He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his chest ease just slightly. "Today, I realized how easy it is to become invisible when you're older, as though the world only sees what you can no longer do." Margaret leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Not everyone sees you that way. Not everyone sets you aside." Harold looked at her, a question flickering behind his tired eyes. "Then how should I see myself?" "Start by recognizing you still have a place in this world, a place in this community, a place among people who value you." The words struck him deeply, brushing against a part of him he had long shut away. He wiped discreetly at the corner of his eye, surprised by the tears forming there. "I forgot what it felt like," he whispered, "to be looked at without judgment." Margaret offered a gentle smile. "Then let tonight remind you." Harold nodded, the movement small but purposeful. The warmth of the tea, the safety of the room, and the kindness in Margaret's presence formed a fragile but undeniable sense of belonging inside him. As the night deepened, Harold's eyelids grew heavy. Margaret noticed and stood up carefully. "You can sleep in the spare room," she said. "It's simple, but the bed is warm." Harold hesitated only a moment, before rising with her help.
She guided him down the hallway to the small guest room, where a neatly made bed and a soft bedside lamp waited. The moment he sat down, relief flooded his face. "Thank you," he murmured, voice thick. "You're welcome," she replied. "Truly." And as Harold lay back, letting the blanket wrap around him, he realized this wasn't just shelter. It was the first step towards feeling human again.
Morning crept gently into Margaret's cottage, the faint glow of dawn stretching across the hallway and slipping beneath the guest room door. Harold stirred slowly, his limbs still stiff but warmer than they had been in days. For a moment he lay still, letting the softness of the bed and the quiet of the cottage anchor him. It had been years since he had woken in a place where he felt genuinely safe. Margaret knocked lightly before peeking in. "Breakfast is nearly ready," she said. "Take your time." Harold nodded, gratitude heavy in his chest. When he finally stepped into the sitting room, he found the table set with tea, warm scones, and a small pot of jam. He paused, overwhelmed by the simple kindness. He had forgotten how meaningful these everyday gestures could be. "You slept well?" Margaret asked. "Better than I expected," Harold replied. "Better than I deserved," Margaret frowned. "No one deserves to sleep in fear or cold, not ever." Before Harold could respond, there was a sudden knock on the cottage door, sharp, hesitant, and far too early to be casual. Margaret exchanged a glance with Harold before opening it. Standing on the doorstep was Nathan, Harold's son-in-law, shifting uncomfortably with his hands shoved into his coat pockets. Margaret stiffened. "What are you doing here?" Nathan cleared his throat. "I came to speak with Harold." His voice trembled with an unease he couldn't hide. "Please." Margaret stepped aside reluctantly. Harold watched him enter, surprise flickering across his face. Nathan avoided his gaze for a moment, then exhaled shakily. "Harold, I didn't sleep last night. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened." Harold said nothing, waiting with a calm that made Nathan's discomfort grow. "I know we handled things badly," Nathan continued. "It wasn't just me, it was all of us. We were overwhelmed. The house felt too tight. Responsibilities kept piling up. We were tired." Harold leaned slightly on his cane. "Being tired is no excuse for cruelty." Nathan winced. "You're right. I just panicked. You were struggling more each week, and I didn't know how to manage it. I felt trapped, and I handled it the worst way possible." He scraped a hand across his face. "I'm ashamed, Harold." Margaret folded her arms, her stance protective. "Words aren't enough." Nathan nodded quickly. "I know. That's why I'm here, to listen, to apologize properly, and to tell you that the door shouldn't have closed on you. Not like that." Harold studied him carefully, the tremor in Nathan's voice revealing sincerity beneath the guilt. "Why now?" he asked softly. "Because I realized something. You weren't the burden. My own impatience was." The cottage fell into silence, heavy but not hostile. Margaret glanced at Harold, waiting to see how he would respond. "You hurt me deeply," Harold said finally. "Not because you turned me away, but because you forgot everything we built together, everything Evelyn and I gave." Nathan lowered his head. "I know, and I'm sorry for all of it." Harold sighed, the sound quiet but full. "I don't know what happens next, but forgiveness isn't a door you can force open. It's something earned slowly." Nathan nodded. "I'll accept that." Margaret stepped slightly closer to Harold, her presence steady and supportive. She didn't speak, but the message was clear. He wasn't facing this alone. Nathan moved toward the door, pausing before stepping out. "If you ever want to talk, or if you need anything, I'm here, truly." Harold nodded faintly, but didn't commit. Nathan left quietly, closing the door with a gentleness unlike the night before. Margaret turned to Harold. "How do you feel?" Harold leaned on his cane, breathing deeply. "Like a chapter hasn't ended,
but maybe it doesn't have to break me." Margaret placed a warm hand on his shoulder. "It won't. Not while you have people who see you clearly." For the first time, Harold felt the truth in those words settle firmly inside him. He had been cast aside, but he wasn't alone.
Harold stayed in Margaret's cottage for the rest of the morning, drinking tea while the sunlight filtered through lace curtains and pooled warmly across the carpet. For a man who had spent years walking carefully around tension, the cottage felt strangely light, as though its walls held memories that comforted rather than judged. He breathed a little easier with each passing hour. Margaret busied herself with small tasks, allowing Harold moments of quiet without making him feel observed. She watered the plants on the windowsill, folded a few dish towels, and tended to her tidy shelf of old novels. Each movement carried the calm steadiness that had become her signature, and Harold found himself grounding in it without meaning to. When he stood, she noticed the slight sway in his balance. "Are you feeling steady enough for some fresh air?" she asked gently. "Only the lane, nowhere far." Harold nodded. "A short walk might help clear my mind." They stepped outside into a cool midday breeze, the kind that brushed lightly across the cheeks and carried the scent of damp stone. Willowbank Road was alive in its usual quiet way. Mr. Atwell trimming his hedge, Mrs. Beach hanging laundry, two schoolchildren passing with rucksacks bouncing at their sides. Life moved calmly around them, unaware of the storm Harold had walked through the day before. As they walked, several neighbors paused to greet them. Mrs. Beach smiled warmly. "Morning, Margaret. Harold, lovely to see you out." Harold offered a polite nod. "Thank you. It's good to be out." But behind her greeting, Harold sensed something else, something he had not felt in a long while. Recognition. Not for what he could provide, but for who he was. They continued toward the small green, where Harold paused beneath the oak tree from the night before. It looked different in daylight, gentler, almost protective. Margaret watched him quietly, sensing the shift. "You're thinking about yesterday," she said softly. Harold nodded. "It's strange. I feel lighter than I expected. Not healed, not entirely, but not as lost." Margaret's smile was soft. "Sometimes being seen is all a person needs." Harold let his gaze drift over the lane. "It's been a long time since anyone looked at me without expecting something in return." "You're allowed to start again," Margaret said. "New routines, new company, new chapters." He turned toward her, the breeze lifting the edge of his coat. "Do you really think that's possible at my age?" "Absolutely," she replied. "Hope doesn't check a person's age before showing up." Harold laughed gently, surprised by the warmth of it. "You say that as though you know it well." "I do," Margaret said quietly. "After my husband passed, I thought the world had finished with me. But kindness found me again. Slowly, in small ways." Her eyes softened. "And now, it's found you." They stayed there for several minutes, the silence growing comfortable, the breeze carrying the faint rustling of leaves. Harold felt something shift inside him. Not a sudden revelation, but a slow unfurling of acceptance. A new rhythm had begun. Gentle, steady, hopeful, and it was enough.
The afternoon sun filtered gently across Willowbank Road as Harold and Margaret returned from their short walk, the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood settling around them like a soft blanket. Harold felt steadier than he had in days, though every now and then a shadow of uncertainty flickered across him, as if part of him still expected the world to collapse again without warning. When they reached Margaret's garden gate, Harold paused. Across the street, Nathan stood on the pavement, hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked as though he had been waiting for some time, glancing repeatedly toward the cottage, before finally gathering the courage to approach. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, protective instinct rising. Harold steadied himself with a calm breath. "It's all right," he murmured. "Let him speak." Nathan crossed the lane slowly, his posture small, his gaze uncertain. "Harold," he said quietly, "could we talk, just for a moment?"
Harold nodded, though Margaret remained close enough to intervene if needed. Nathan swallowed hard. I wanted to say, yesterday wasn't the man I want to be. I panicked. We all did. The house felt like pressure instead of comfort, and instead of asking for help, I let frustration take over. He paused, eyes glistening. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did, and I should never have pushed you out. Harold looked at him steadily. It wasn't only yesterday, he said. It's been building for a long time, ignoring me, speaking over me, making decisions as though I wasn't there. Nathan nodded, shame tightening his jaw. You're right. I became someone small, someone I don't admire. He looked up slowly. But I'm trying to do better. Margaret folded her arms. Trying isn't the same as taking responsibility. Nathan exhaled shakily. I know, so let me be clear. He turned fully to Harold. You deserved better, and nothing about what happened reflects your worth. It reflects my failures. Harold's chest tightened, emotions conflicting inside him. Hearing acknowledgement, real acknowledgement, created a sting he didn't expect. It wasn't forgiveness, but truth spoken plainly had its own weight. I don't know what you expect from me, Harold said quietly. Nothing, Nathan replied. You owe me nothing. I just needed you to know I'm sorry, truly. He looked down at his shoes. And if you ever decide to talk again, I'll listen properly. Harold studied him for a long moment, his slumped shoulders, his trembling hands, the genuine remorse in his voice. There was a time Harold had thought of Nathan almost like a son. It was a complicated ache to see him humbled now. Harold said, I hear your apology, but I need time, more than a day, more than an apology on a doorstep. Nathan nodded firmly. Take all the time you need. With that, he stepped back, offering Harold a small, sincere look before turning to leave. As he walked down the lane, the tension in Harold's chest slowly eased. Margaret touched Harold's arm lightly. You handled that beautifully. Harold shook his head slightly. I just spoke honestly, she replied. Sometimes honesty is the hardest thing to stand in. They stepped into the cottage garden, the scent of lavender rising with the soft breeze. Harold paused beside the roses Margaret tended so carefully. Do you think things can ever feel normal again? He asked quietly. Margaret considered his question. Normal? She repeated. I'm not sure that's the right word. But something new? Something good? Yes, very much so. Harold absorbed her words, letting them settle. It feels strange, he said, to realize the world can give back what it once took. Margaret smiled, gentle and warm. That's what hope does. It finds the cracks and grows through them. Harold breathed deeply, feeling a fragile steadiness spreading through him. Maybe it wasn't the past he needed to reclaim. Maybe it was the future he hadn't yet imagined.
As evening settled over Willowbank Road, Margaret lit a small lamp in the sitting room, its warm glow softening the cottage's familiar corners. Harold stood by the window, watching the street beyond the glass as the sky darkened into shades of navy and violet. The world outside looked calmer now, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet that felt almost reflective. Margaret approached him with 2 cups of tea, her steps gentle across the rug. Come sit, she said softly. You've had a long day. Harold took the cup with both hands, grateful for the warmth. They sat together on the small sofa, their shoulders not quite touching, but close enough to share the same calm space. The cottage hummed with a peaceful stillness, broken only by the occasional crackle from the heater. You handled everything with dignity, Margaret said. Most people would have shouted or shut down. Harold shook his head slowly. I felt the shouting inside me, but it wouldn't have changed anything. He paused, his gaze falling to the tea in his hands. What I needed wasn't a victory, it was truth. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And you got it. Harold exhaled, the breath leaving him with quiet relief. For the first time in years, I'm not carrying it alone. Not the grief, not the disappointment, not the fear. Margaret's voice softened. You don't have to carry any of it alone now. The words settled between them like a small, steady flame. Harold felt something shift inside him, a release he hadn't expected, a letting go of the belief that life at 70 meant nothing new could begin. He glanced at Margaret, noticing the warmth in her expression, the sincerity in her presence. I never thought kindness would find me again, he said quietly. It tends to arrive when we least expect it, Margaret replied, and usually through the right people. Outside, the street lamp flickered on, casting a soft amber glow across the lane. Harold watched it for a moment, then rested his cane against the sofa and allowed himself to lean back, his body relaxing in a way it hadn't done for months. He wasn't healed, he wasn't entirely whole, but he was no longer forgotten. Harold lifted his gaze to Margaret, a faint, hopeful smile touching his face. Maybe tomorrow, he said softly, we can walk a little further. Margaret smiled back. I'd like that. And in that quiet room, beneath the soft lamplight, a new chapter began. Not loud or dramatic, but steady, human, and alive.